How are you doing, sir?
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for our invitation. How is everything?
I'm well. And you?
I'm very well, and thanks for honoring this invitation. It means a lot to me, the event member of the community, and the audience. Okay, I'll quickly give the biography now, and then we take over the stage. Uh, Hundeyin is a writer, investigative journalist, and broadcaster whose work has appeared on CNN, The African Report, Al Jazeera, and The Washington Post. His work as a satire on The Other News, Nigerians' answer to the Daily Show, has featured in the New Yorker magazine and the Netflix documentary Larry Charles' Dangerous World of Comedy. In 2018, he was nominated by the United States State Department for the 2019 Edward Murrow Program for journalists under the International Research and Leadership Program, IVRP. In February 2021, David won the People Journalism Prize for Africa 2022 for his work on reviewing predatory legislation that was being rushed through Nigeria's House of Representatives. In June 2021, he was selected as the African Only Representative on a list of 12 writers and journalists from around the world, chosen to part in the Substack inaugural $1 million Substack local program. In December, he was named the GRC, Governors Risk Compliance Anti-Fin Crime Reporter of the Year at the Nigerian GRC Award. Most recently, in March 2022, his post-meat investigation, Who Killed Amy Umorin, made a global shortlist at the 2022 Stigma Award for Data Journalism. Actually, I don't want to go into I, but then if you want to be successful in journalism in Africa, not successful, hyper successful, I think you just have the face slots. So, guys, David, you have the platform.
Right. I thought my mic was muted. Right. So good evening, everyone. Thanks to Insights for giving me this stage. I've seen that my slot is for 90 minutes. Rest assured, I have no intention whatsoever of speaking for 90 minutes. I don't know how to sit down in one place and listen to my own voice for 1.5 hours. So whatever I'm going to say, I don't think it's going to exceed 30 to 45 minutes. Um, but hopefully there might be some sort of interactive session, hopefully. So to start with, I think an impactful way of passing across the information I'd like to pass across is to tell my own story. Now, I can see on my video feed that there appears to be some sort of pixelation at the top of my head. I'm using a green screen, so please bear with me. I'm not sure why that is happening. It's not supposed to be the case, but I don't know whether I need new lights, so just try to ignore it. So, as I said, I will start with telling my career story, which I think is a useful entry point into communicating how I think a modern day writer or journalist in sub-Saharan Africa can try to build a successful career and a work profile, a work portfolio, and a following, an audience. So my foray into writing goes back well over 2.5 decades. So I think the first time I ever wrote something that achieved any sort of critical acclaim, I think, was when I was in primary school. That was the very first time when someone ever, so a teacher told me that, hey, you're pretty good at this. And that just sort of stuck in my mind. It never left. In 2003, 2002 actually, when I was in JSS2, I was a secondary school student at Atlantic Hall. I put in an entry to the Peak Mom of the Year National Essay Writing Competition then, and I first won the Lagos and Ogun region, and then progressed to the national stage, and also won the national competitions. That was the first time I ever won a national competition. I was 12 years old at the time. So it was in early 2003. Fast forward 4 years, in 2006, I was in sixth form college at the time, and I submitted an entry to the Royal Commonwealth Society, which used to have a global essay writing competition called Write Around the World. So I submitted an entry. I was 16 at the time, and I came third worldwide. So that was the second time I did something that achieved international acclaim. I also the same year I also came second in the Ove Brume a writing competition, which was a national writing competition. So that was the year when I was obviously off to university. This was 2006. I was choosing the subjects that I was going to study for my A levels, and then from there off to uni. And I decided that I was going to leave the quote unquote science class because, as typical Nigerian parents, my folks had lumped me into the science class. That apparently smart people do science. And since we have designated you as a smart kid, you are going to do science, even though I had no interest whatsoever in the physical sciences. So I was doing physics, chemistry, biology, math, and add math. Right, I was doing five math subjects out of six subjects in total, which was an absolute nightmare for me. So going into my A level year, I rebelled a bit. Um, I knew that I couldn't switch into the arts wholesale like I wanted to. So I sort of had to find a midpoint. So I switched to the commercial and humanities class. So yeah, so at A level, I did business studies, economics, and geography, which I enjoyed immensely and which I got very good grades on. So going into university, bear in mind that I come from a family where everyone else did a professional program at university. So my brother studied medicine, he's a doctor now. My older sister studied engineering, she's a systems analyst now. My immediate older sister, she's a banker. My younger sister, she's a stockbroker. And then there's me, who is the undisputed black sheep of the family and has always been. I said that I wanted to study journalism, and they didn't understand what the hell is wrong with this guy. Of all the things you could possibly do, why would you want to study journalism? Why would you want to be a journalist? What could you hope to achieve with with that career choice? But I knew what I wanted, and I went for it. I'm a very stubborn person, so they didn't like it. They weren't happy. But eventually, in 2008, I started studying at the University of Hull. The name of my program was Creative Writing and Media, Culture, and Society. So the course was sort of split into three. So a third of it was English and creative writing as a core writing course. The second third was classical media and journalism training, particularly in broadcast media. There was an emphasis on digital and broadcast media. And then a third of it, the final third of it was like media theory and analysis. Um, After I finished, the initial plan I had was get a job at the BBC, settle down with my girlfriend, buy a house with a dog and a mini, and live happily ever after. So of course that didn't happen. None of that happened, and I found myself working somehow at KPMG, which was just nowhere near what my career plan looked like at the time. And I wasn't even a consultant. I was basically doing like a contact center job at KPMG. Like it wasn't even a graduate position, and I wasn't utilizing anything I'd learned in school, and it was sort of like a dead end job. So that was when I made the decision to return to Nigeria and sort of start afresh. So in 2013, I returned to Nigeria. I started afresh. I did my NYSC in Ekiti State at a place called the Broadcasting Service of Ekiti State. So I used to draft news bulletins, and I also used to present the business news at the news at 7 for a while on EKTV. In June 2014, after completing my NYC, I returned to Lagos, and that was when I started a career in marketing. Now, initially, the plan was for me to start a career in print journalism. Right, I had actually passed the assessment to start work at Vanguard. A lot of people don't know this story. Um, the then editor of Vanguard, was very well known, to a family friend of mine. So he made the introduction, and I was given a series of tests and assignments to do, and I aced everything in record time. And then the editor took me into his office the day I came to like do it like salary negotiation. And he was like, you know what? Let me not waste your time. I know that if we take you in here, you're not going to spend 6 months with us. You're going to leave. So let me help you. He thought he was doing me a favor. So he made a call to a friend of his called Tunji Olubodi, who ran an agency called Verdant Zeal, an advertising agency in Ikeja GRA. And that was how he made that introduction. So um, I obviously aced all their assessments at Verdant Zeal. I actually got a success email from them. We're happy to offer you a position, blah 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 blah. And then for one reason or the other, which I'm still not clear about, that didn't work out. So then I ended up starting work at a sister agency, which was a PR agency called Black House Media, BHM Group. So I started work there in October 2014 as an executive intern. And by the time I left in May 2016, I was head of content. They had created a content department for me, basically, because writing was my forte. That's what I was good at. Um, so when I left, the calculation I had in my head was that, look, all the fantastic work that BHM is doing, all the campaigns it's running, the newsletters it's sending out, all the content that BHM is pushing out, I'm the one writing it. Which means objectively I'm pretty good at this stuff. So I can start up my own content writing agency, my own copywriting agency, and I'll be good. And it wasn't a bad calculation. However, the timing was spectacularly wrong. This was in 2016, in the middle of the first recession in 25, 30 years. And in a recession, one of the very first things to go is marketing budget, marketing spend. So at that time, that's not when anyone was taking the risk of hiring this 26-year-old upstart who says that he's running a content agency when most people didn't even know what a content creation agency was at the time. So that failed spectacularly. And I also obviously made some really poor business decisions at the time. So that failed spectacularly. And by August 2016, I found myself driving an Uber. I put my car on Uber. I was driving an Uber for 3 months. Again, a story which a lot of people don't know. Eventually, I found my way back into paid full-time employment. I went back to marketing. I was working at an agency called Acquiring Digital Estates. It's a digital agency. And then in April 2017, the opportunity to join Channels TV came up. I had seen an advert in February, which was recruiting for a political satire show. The show didn't even have a name or a structure. I just saw the advert and I responded. They asked for a comedy script. I did one. They liked it. So they asked for another. So I did one. They liked it even better. So then the Americans who were actually behind the show, it was an American company called Pilot Media Initiatives. They then reached out to me and they said, right, well, we want to offer you a contract. But before then, we also want you to recruit the rest of the writing team. So that show was what later became The Other News with Oke Bakassi, which is why I refer to the show as my baby, because the even the initial conversations around the structure of the show, should it be like the Daily Show with Trevor Noah, or should it be like the what's it called, Saturday Night Live? We were the ones who had those conversations. Myself, Dylan Case, and Patrick and Kevin. It was a really fun time, and this was a type of format which hadn't been attempted in Nigeria yet. So I spent just over a year at Channels TV working on the other news, which was where all those nominations you mentioned at the outset got nominated by the U.S. State Department, then got featured on Netflix and all those things. That was where those things came from. So coming out of my time at the other news, I then felt ready to reattempt launching a copywriting agency again. This time around, it was significantly more successful than the first time because I wasn't trying to focus. I wasn't trying to recruit Nigerian clients. I had been exposed to an international market, to an international audience, and I was doing work exclusively for like American, Australian, European clients. So the money was quite good, good enough for me to. At my peak, I had about 5 full-time members of staff. I was doing pretty well. However, in 2019, which was a year after I had left Channels, that was when I made the decision to sort of pivot away from just writing and copywriting, start doing sort of hardcore journalism, moving into investigative journalism. At the time, I was doing sort of like analysis and opinion columns and things like that. I was mostly just focused on copywriting and content writing on behalf of clients. But then I had started seeing the impact that some of my writing within the Nigerian space was having. And as I've said in several places before, this was where I had that light bulb moment above my head that, okay, for the first time, my writing isn't going to be just about making money. It's not just going to be about making payroll this month and paying off staff members this month. which was all starting to feel very pointless and monotonous. That for the first time, I feel as if my writing actually has a larger purpose to it. So eventually, to cut a long story short, I shut down my agency. It was called Top Start Content Services. I shut it down. I let all my staff go, and I basically went freelance. So I was still doing work for clients, but only just enough work to basically pay my bills and fund my lifestyle while I was doing what I really wanted to do, which was investigative journalism. At the time, I had signed a contract with Newswire NGR. The money wasn't great. I'll say that. I was getting paid 20,000 naira per story, and I had a contract for 5 stories a month. So that came to about 100,000 naira a month, which wasn't really that much. It was paying my office rent and it was paying my fuel bill every month, pretty much. But beyond that, it wasn't really doing much. But I wasn't doing it for the money at all, because first of all, I had my own source of income that I was still keeping, and then I was consumed with a sense of meaning, with a sense of purpose. Like, this is what I want to do. This work that I'm doing is actually having some sort of material impact in the country around me. People's lives have been saved because I sat down on my laptop and I wrote something. That means that this thing I'm doing is important. It has a wider meaning to it. So I dedicated myself to it. Maybe a bit too much, as you now know, obviously. So going into 2020, that was when I sort of fully exploded in a journalism sense and also in a wider career sense. I use the term exploded, not necessarily in a positive sense, but also to mean that life as I knew it changed permanently. 2020 was the year when I had to leave Nigeria permanently. I fled Nigeria basically. As you may know, I live in exile under asylum protection. Um, my Nigerian citizenship is now more nominal than fact. I don't know if I'm ever actually going to be able to visit Nigeria again. As we speak, I'm reliably informed that certain elements, whose names I'm not going to mention, actually have an open contract on my head in an 8-figure naira sum. So, like, these are some of the realities that I'm having to deal with. So, it's not all roses and butterflies. Far from it. Now, the reason for telling this sort of really shortened version of my story thus far was to give some sort of an on ramp into what it actually means to do the sort of writing and sort of journalism that I do. And the reason I thought it's important to give that on ramp, to give that basic understanding of how this works, is that when I was looking at the flyer for this event, I saw the way it was designed, and I had this really snazzy looking photo, and the caption said how to build a successful career in writing and journalism. I thought, wow, if only it were that, if only it were that glamorous, and if only it were that simple. However, I'm not in the business of lying to people. I'm not in the business of misleading my audiences. So what I'm trying to do is to tell people exactly what the reality of um, writing and journalism is, and if after hearing everything I have to say, then they still decide that this is what they want to do, then by all means, please do go ahead. Now, the first thing to understand about breaking into um, audience recognition as a writer, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, in our parts of the world, is that there is a 95 to 100% probability that for the first few months, possibly even years of your attempts to break in, you are not going to get paid. It's just how it works. So in my case, when I was pivoting away from doing my copywriting from my copywriting agency into investigative journalism, what made it possible to make that switch, to make that pivot, was some of the work that I was doing on platforms like the Scoop. You may not remember what the Scoop is. It's a defunct website. It used to be a popular Nigerian journalism platform. Now, some of my earliest work, some of my most important work, actually, some of my best writing at the time, was on the Scoop. I had a bi-weekly column on the Scoop, and I wasn't getting paid for it. It was free work, basically. But what the Scoop did for me was that it provided an audience to leverage on. Bear in mind that at the time, even though I had all this fantastic work that I had done, my work had been featured on Netflix, I had been nominated by the US State Department for the IVLP, blah, 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 blah. Nobody in Nigeria knew who I was. In fact, more people outside of Nigeria knew who I was than within Nigeria. Using my social media following as a metric, for example, and by the way, social media following is an important metric if you want to be a successful writer or journalist, just putting that out there, whether I like it or not. It's not something I like to reference, but it's just a material reality. So using my social media following then as a metric, I don't think I had up to 1,000 followers across all social media put together. So that's Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn. I don't think I had up to 1,000 put together. Nobody knew who I was. That's the first thing. The Scoop gave me an audience to leverage on. The Scoop had an audience of its own. It had large social media assets. It had a large readership base, and crucially, by being published regularly there, my my name was being regularly introduced to the Nigerian audience. Because it's not important to just have one or two sort of articles that maybe they go viral or something, because anybody can just write something that goes viral once in a while. Broken clocks are correct twice in a day. What is more important is consistency. So I was able to put out these sort of long form analysis columns on the Scoop every 2 weeks, and then the Scoop was able to market them properly. The editor was a guy called Stanley Azwakola. Stanley has some knowledge in digital marketing and content marketing. Stanley was brilliant at using social media to properly market content, basically, which was a starting point for me. I wasn't getting paid, but it was opening me up to new audiences, and my name was getting known. As a result of the work that I was doing on the Scoop, Business Day then reached out. So Business Day ended up becoming my first ever paid um, ongoing writing engagement within the Nigerian space. I'm still writing for Business Day to date as we speak. This is 2022. So it was May 2019, or was it April 2019 that I started writing for Business Day. So in November 2022, and as yesterday, I still wrote a column for Business Day. So at the time, I was doing it once a week. Now I'm doing it 3 times a week, right? So Business Day was the first time I ever got paid for my writing in the Nigerian space. So that was key. So the first thing that I mentioned is that you have to be prepared to put in some unpaid work, because it's a space where, unfortunately, everybody seems to be trying to break in, because everybody fancies themselves to be a writer, even if they're not really. So writing is a bit like music. Everybody thinks that they're a musician. Everybody thinks that they have this mixtape or something. If you listen to it, oh my God, it's fire. Just give it a listen. And you listen to it and it's absolute trash. That's how it is with the writing as well. Everyone thinks they're a brilliant writer, even though they're not. So if you're trying to stand out and distinguish yourself in this space, you have to be prepared, first of all, to be unpaid for a while, and then be consistent, put stuff out consistently, which leads into the second point, which is that leveraging social media properly. As much as a lot of people who consider themselves writers think of themselves as above the social media thing, they turn up their noses at social media. They think social media is for the masses. The work I do is intellectual. It's not for those Raz people on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. As much as you might think that, the truth is that those Raz people on those social media platforms are a very important part of what will make you a successful writer, like it or not. So I remember when I was at the other news, the my American trainer Dylan Case was the one who first taught me how to properly curate a Twitter account as a writer. There's some very important things that he told me, which some of these principles I still use today. This was something he told me in 2017. So he told me, for example, as a writer, the first thing you want to do is make sure that all your social media has your own name on it, the name that your writing appears under. So if that's your birth name, that's how it has to be. Your name has to appear on all your social media. Because at the time, I was one of those people that used to use, like, I think I was using a handle called at diary of something, like just a random handle, right? Because he told me this thing, then I went and changed my handle across all social media platforms to at David Hundeyin. He was the first person who made it clear to me that if you are trying to curate a public profile and a social profile as a writer or journalist of notes, people need to be able to find you. People need to be able to do a Google search and find you instantly. Not that they have to ask that, what is this guy's handle? And then they hear from the grapevine or they hear from Gist that he's the one using this handle. No, you must signpost yourself and identify yourself readily. People must be able to find you easily so that you stop being a sort of cult hero. You stop being somebody that is known within this small circle and you start being accessible to a national or global audience. That was the very important thing. Your name must appear across all your social media platforms. If possible, your handle must be the same across all social platforms. So if you are at David Day on Twitter, it should be the same on Instagram. If it's possible to be the same on Facebook as well, because Facebook also has handles, do that. If it's possible to be the same on LinkedIn, be that as well. And then I believe even YouTube has handles now. So if it's possible to be there as well, do that. Keep it consistent across all platforms. That's one of the building blocks for curating a brand as a writer or a public personality of any description, to be honest. So those are the first two things, three things actually. Be prepared to do some unpaid work to get exposure. Be consistent in putting out this work. Curate a social media presence well, and to curate that social media presence well, your profiles must be readily discoverable, which means that your writing name must appear across all of them, if possible in the same format across all social platforms. And also in the process of curating this social media experience for your audience, um, something else Dylan told me at the time, and I'm I'm going to basically just repeat what he said. So he said the easiest way to understand how to curate a social media profile as a writer is to look at those who are doing it successfully. So he recommended people like Mike Drucker, people like Rob Delaney. If you don't know who these people are, just Google them. Rob Delaney and Mike Drucker. They are very, very famous Hollywood writers. They write movies, they write video games. They're very, very successful. They're the pinnacle of their game. They're the type of writer that gets paid six figures, seven figures in US dollars to work on a single movie script or to work on a single video game script. Those kinds of writers, like they are at the top of their game. So he said, look at how they curate the handles. Look at how they tell jokes. If they do tell jokes, look at how often they do. Look at how their jokes are structured, the type of humor they use, because everything that you do on your social profile as a writer is part of your professional profile, right? So even your quote unquote shit posts, even the shit posting you do with your friends, there has to be a certain register that you use. There has to be a certain um, maybe an ironic tone to it, or a sarcastic tone, or and like an acerbic sense of humor. There has to be something that is distinctive about it that marks you out as more than just a social media guy. Like there has to be something more to you, and the best way to do that is to basically look at those who are already doing it successfully. So I spent like close to a year, basically. This was between 2017 and 2018, just studying Rob Delaney and Mike Drucker did it, how they curate their writing profiles. At the time, they were also, bear in mind that the it I hadn't yet made the decision to pivot fully into journalism the way I do it now. I was still thinking of going into writing, like commercial, like copywriting, script writing, that sort of thing. So those are the types of writers that I was looking at then. Later on, I also started following more international journalists. So people who work at the New York Times, Reuters, AFP, Washington Post, LA Times, Times of England, the Guardian, you know, international journalists. I started following them en masse as well. In fact, if you check the list of people that I'm following on Twitter, you see them in their hundreds there. Because it's very important that if you're trying to, as they say in computer lingo, garbage in, garbage out. So it's what you take in that you're going to put out as well. So if you are consuming content which has that tone and that feel that you are trying to achieve, that's probably what you're going to be able to put out as well. So if you have a timeline that is full of uh, Josh Too Funny and Taoma, you know it might not be the best. Which is not to say that you shouldn't watch Josh Too Funny and Taoma. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I'm saying that basically you want to be very deliberate about the type of content you consume and how often you consume it, because that has a very direct impact on how your mind is able to process things and then help you put out um, a social experience that makes you perceived a certain way. Because whether you like it or not, a large part of the experience of being a writer is being perceived a certain way, right? You can be a brilliant writer, but if the world doesn't recognize you as a brilliant writer, it doesn't matter. So social proof is everything in this field, right? Like writing is one of those fields where you can't hide from social proof. As much as it might make you uncomfortable, you can't hide from it. People have to see your work, people have to see you, people have to make judgments on you and your work all the time. And a lot of the time, people might not be able to distinguish or differentiate you from your work. And you need to be willing to accept that that's just how it is. I'm just looking at the screen here. The name is not Mark Rocker. I said Mike Drucker. So that's Mike, then a space, then Drucker. That's Drucker. So Mike Drucker and Rob Delaney. But that's by the way. So those are three things that I pointed out now. Be prepared to do some unpaid work. Be consistent. Curate your social media properly. And then for me, the fourth point, and in my opinion, the single most important point of all, if you are trying to build a successful career as a writer or a journalist in Nigeria or in sub-Saharan Africa, you there's no easy way to say this. You have to have the talent for it. And what I mean by that is that I come across dozens of people seemingly on a daily basis who maybe they send DMs or they get into contact with me somehow. They go to my website, look at my contact details. They send me a WhatsApp message or something, and it's different variations of the same message. Oh, I know how to write. I want to work with you, or I've written this and that. How do I get my stuff published on so and so platform? I'm like, first of all, uh, like I can't give this feedback to everyone individually, but it's something I can say in this forum because this is the kind of forum where you say things like this. You read a lot of these materials that people send through, and for lack of a better term, the writing is very pedestrian. It's just not good writing. It's just not. It's not terrible writing, but it's something that is worse than terrible, which is that it's mediocre, right? Like I feel like in this space, you will either be outstanding or you be terrible. You shouldn't be mediocre because mediocre is worse than being terrible. Mediocre means that you are forgettable. The worst thing that you can be as a writer or a journalist is forgettable. That somebody reads your stuff and it leaves no impression whatsoever. Somebody reads your stuff and like maybe they don't even make it to the end of the article before clicking the X button and moving on someone else, somewhere else. Or if they read it to the end, it doesn't occur to them to scroll to the top to see who wrote it, to see whose name, whose byline appears there. You make no impact. That is the worst. That is death for you as a writer or a journalist. You need to be able to make an impression. So your work has to be actually good. So I guess this ties into the first point that you should be prepared to do some unpaid work, because part of that process of doing unpaid work is that you are getting better at your craft. Now, as part of this point that I'm raising, this fourth point, which is that your work has to actually be good, a very important part of refining the quality of your work as a writer and a journalist is subjecting it to social proof. I know I've mentioned the concept of social proof before, and I'll keep on mentioning it because, again, this is that platform where, you know, this is the subject that we're discussing, so I can be completely honest about this, right? The mistake that I see a lot of people, including some of my colleagues, make is that you think, right, I won an award when I was in university. Maybe I won a campus award for journalism or something. Um, Everybody that reads my stuff on Facebook says that I know how to write. Therefore, that means I'm a great writer. That means I'm a good writer. That means that my work, as it is, like all I need is just to get it on the right platform, just to get in the front of people's eyeballs, and I'll be successful. No, you have to be willing to accept that, especially if you are young, the circle of people you have around you is not a very large circle. So if you won an award on campus, maybe the total number of people who read that thing and were responsible for giving you that award, maybe it's like 200 people. It doesn't mean in the wider world it's actually any good. So you have to be willing to let your ego take a hell of a beating. A hell of a beating. You have to be willing to put your stuff out in front of 20,000 eyeballs and get 600 people saying, "What is this rubbish? Why did I waste my time reading this nonsense?" That thing is very painful. Oh my God, it hurts when you put your heart and soul into something and you put it in front of an audience and people just absolutely trash it and say this is nonsense, right? Like go and find another career. Writing is not your calling. It's very painful, but it's a necessary part of growing. You can't become better without it. You can't. Um, in amidst all the insults and the criticisms, you will see a few nuggets that people will mention, a few things that people will mention, sometimes in very dismissive language or very insulting or patronizing language. But again, that ego death is something you need to be able to control, right? And pick out the important messages from there so that you can improve your writing. Um, maybe in my case, because obviously I've been writing at a high level for a very, 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 very long time, for decades. So maybe at least in the Nigerian space, I didn't really face that much of that. However, in the international space, I can tell you for free, I faced a lot of that, especially when I was just starting out in the news space, when I was doing stuff for Yahoo Finance, CNN, all those websites back in between 2017 and early 2019. There was a lot of that, right? So maybe because back then when I used to do breaking news, which is one of the reasons to today I'm not a fan of breaking news. But back then when I used to write breaking news stories for like Yahoo Finance or CCN.com or BDC or what's it called, BTCmanager.com, right? Some of these like finance news websites. I'd do a story and you'd read the comments in the story and you would just get absolutely trashed in the comments. Like, do you know, how can you not know the difference between this and this? Like, how is Yahoo hiring? Some people even explicitly mention my race. That Yahoo has started hiring cheap labor from Africa to write about people who don't know anything. That when you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. You know, referring to me. And apparently Yahoo was the one paying peanuts, and I was the monkey. Who was putting out substandard work, and it hurts. It really did, because obviously I had a self-image of myself as a world-class writer and journalist, and then here I am having my work social proofed, and it's getting absolutely destroyed in the public space, and it hurts. But it was also one of the best things that could have happened to me, because what it did to me was that it made me ensure That every single thing that was criticized, every mistake that I made, because I did make mistakes. There were a couple of times I messed up on a couple of things. I didn't, maybe I didn't fully research the definition of something, and I'd use a certain word in a place I'm not supposed to use it. There was a time I used the term fat finger. I don't know if anyone here is conversant with financial terminology. If you are, you know what fat finger is. And I used it in place of something else, which I used it in the wrong place, and then it ended up basically distorting the entire story, and even distorting the headline. And my editor didn't catch the mistake in time, and the story came out, and I ended up looking like a big ass. And I didn't even end up getting paid for that story because of how big that mistake was. And it was really embarrassing. There was another time when um I I did a story and I didn't take enough care, because how it is in breaking news is that when one person breaks a story, another person has broken it, you two, you have to break it. Even if you don't have the sources that they have, you have to basically go and read their story and then rewrite it, basically, so that it's not plagiarism, right? And basically, even though this I had done that, and the story, like, it would obviously pass the plagiarism detector, it wasn't plagiarized. However, I hadn't checked to find out that the source of this story was completely it wasn't even a story that was sourced from like a source. It was more like an original story idea that platform had. So by me merely reproducing this, it was so clear that I had copied this idea from this other platform. And this is one of the reasons why I'm not a fan of breaking news, right? Until today, I don't do breaking news because I have very bad memories of my time with breaking news, right? And that other platform then immediately put out a tweet and even tagged my handle. This was back in 2019, or was it 2018? And said, "You stole our work," you know, and it was an incredibly embarrassing situation to be in. So these things happen. So when you are building your profile and your portfolio, you have to be prepared for your ego to take a hell of a beating, because social proof is not something you can get away from in this line of work at all. Social proof is everything. So um, it's not enough for your family and friends to tell you that your work is great. Your family and friends might not even be telling you the truth. They might just be telling you stuff to make you feel better, or because they don't want. It's just not worth the while. Yeah, he thinks he's a writer. It's fine, whatever. Like, please don't stress me. But in front of that wider audience, that's where your social proof is going to come from. That's where your ego is going to be tested, and you need to be willing to take that beating. It's it's for the best. It's difficult, it's painful, but it's for the best. Now the fifth, and I think the final thing that I'll mention before I end this, because as I said, I'm not a fan of talking, droning endlessly on and on and on. The fifth thing I would mention, which I would pick out from my own story, is that in the process of building a portfolio and a career as a writer or as a journalist, um, you also have to, I'm trying to think of a way to say this without coming across as cliche. Um, you have to accept that how you wrote 3 years ago necessarily will not be the same as how you write now, and how you write now would necessarily not be the same as how you write 3 years from now. And what I mean by that is that, um, especially if you are doing things that involve introspection, things like analysis, opinion columns, op-eds, things that require you expressing how you think about something or how you feel about something, you shouldn't be afraid to evolve or to change. So there were some things that I wrote 3 years ago, which I probably wouldn't write now. There were some ways I used to write 3 years ago that I probably wouldn't write now. Um, there were some messages that I used to pass across 3 years ago that I probably wouldn't pass across now. I'll give you an example. So in 2018, I was working with a platform called ccn.com. It's defunct now. It doesn't. The website still works, but I mean, stories haven't been published on it since last year, so it's basically defunct now. Back then, CCN was a popping website, right? And I was doing some really good revenue from CCN. So in naira terms, anyway, from CCN alone, back when I was running my copywriting agency at the time, I think the least I ever billed CCN for in a single calendar month was about 670,000 naira. The least. Sometimes went up to about 1.5 million naira, and this was monthly. So I was doing very well from this particular platform, CCN. And CCN was it's a Norwegian platform, but most of the writers on CCN were Americans. And CCN was a very, very right-leaning website, a very conservative, Republican-leaning website, very much so. And not even Republican-leaning; it was sort of almost far right, like extremist, white nationalist kind of thing. It was that kind of place. So I kind of closed my eyes to it for a while because at the end of the day, man, if you are billing somebody a million naira a month and the person is a white nationalist, it's like, well, your white nationalism. Me, I'm here in Nigeria. Like, Sapa is my problem. I need money. So your white nationalism in Arizona or wherever, it's not really my issue. So whatever. I kind of turned a blind eye to it. And then the platform started explicitly requiring members of staff, including myself, to include this sort of like right-wing dog whistles in our reporting. So there was a story I did in 2019. Incidentally, this was a story which first introduced me to my Nigerian audience. The first story I ever did, which went viral in Nigeria, was a story I did shortly after the 2019 elections. It was called the politics of envy, the socialist politics of envy. I remember that article. That article went super viral in Nigeria, even though it wasn't written for a Nigerian audience at all. And I was a bit horrified when it went viral in Nigeria because I was like, oh my god, like you people weren't supposed to see this. It wasn't for you. But it went, I think it got like 30,000 retweets in one day or something. I was like, oh my God, no. But for whatever reason, I got away with it. So what it was, in that article, I was trying to communicate that the 2019 election in Nigeria was decided along economic lines, and that the messaging that was used by the Buhari regime to win the election was a message that basically glorified poverty. The whole live within your means thing, versus the message of the challenger, who then was Atiku Abubakar at the time, which was a message which was about economic growth, basically, and prosperity, whereas Buhari was about fighting corruption, like this sort of like really like small-minded cliche kind of thing. So like that was the message I was trying to pass across in the story, which was a decent message. However, in order for the story to get published on CCN, the editor explicitly required me to include some red meat for this sort of right-wing American reader base. So I had to include Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who is she's a Democrat congresswoman in the U.S. At the time, she was like their number one hate figure. Like, for whatever reason, the right wing just absolutely hated her in the US. Right? I'm not going to go into like internal US politics, but she was like their hate figure. So he required me, my editor at the time required me to sort of equate this lady to Buhari, you know, which was a very dishonest comparison, to be honest, because Alexandra Ocasio Cortez and Muhammad Buhari have about as much in common as, you know, myself and and Bola Tinubu have in common. Like they're night and day. That's the honest truth. But that's what I was required to do, right? I wanted to do a story about Nigeria, but in order to get this story about Nigeria published, it needed to be it needed to include some red meat, which was actually inaccurate. And it worked, which is why I said when it went viral in Nigeria, I was horrified because I was worried that is somebody going to pick up on this particular thing that yes, 90% of this article is accurate, but this 10% where Alexandra Ocasio Cortez was mentioned was total bullshit, you know? And that wasn't me that put that in of my own volition. That was the platform that required me to do that because it's a right leaning platform. And if you don't put it in, it won't get published. And if it doesn't get published, you don't get paid, you know? And this was like a 3,000 word story. So the longer it is, the more you get paid. So, I mean, that story alone was worth like $150 at least to me. So he was like, "Ah, I need the money, oh, so let me just publish it." And now, the person that I am now, 3 years later, I don't need to do stuff like that because my profile has grown. Um, if an editor wants me to do something I don't want to do, I can push back now and say no, I'm not doing that. And if you won't give me the gig, it's fine. Several other people will give me a gig. But back then, like I was kind of in a situation where I was sort of like powerless. I had to do certain things because I was trying to make it. So, but along the along the way, I haven't been afraid to grow, basically to let myself get bigger than that. Because the mistake I've seen some of my colleagues make, because there were other Nigerians who worked with this platform then, by the way, and many of them are still pretty much where I left them in 2018 and 2019. They're still there, still working for those kinds of platforms, still writing those kinds of stories that they don't believe in because, well, what are you going to do? You need the money. And the mistake that they made and are making, I believe, is that they refuse to grow. How I grew was that when I realized that I was building an audience in Nigeria and that my work in Nigeria was starting to have an impact, I was able to let go of that money, right? Because I'm not gonna lie to you, it's not easy when you have a guaranteed, strong revenue stream like that to let go of it and then focus on this thing, which has very high potential, and you can see that it has very high growth potential, but it's also not making you that kind of money, right? So you are getting the kind of audience you've never had before. You're having 100,000, 200,000 people reading your articles now, but it's not paying you like what that other thing used to pay you. So the lazy thing to do would be to just retreat back into your comfort zone and go back to what you are familiar with and keep on doing the stuff you don't believe in because, well, they're going to pay you, and at the end of the day, Owoni Koko is money that is important. But I wasn't afraid to let go of that money and dive into the unknown and say, right, this new terrain that I'm discovering, I'm going to dive into it. I'm going to explore it. I'm going to see how far it can take me. And as it happens, it has taken me a lot further than anything all those platforms could have, anywhere those platforms could have taken me to. I mean, ccn.com, as I mentioned earlier, is defunct now. It doesn't publish anymore. It's defunct, but I'm still here. I have a platform now that is more successful than ccn.com ever was in terms of reader numbers. So just don't be afraid to let go of stuff that you used to do. When you're trying to make it, when you're trying to build an audience, when you're trying to build a following, you will make mistakes. Allow yourself to make those mistakes, but also don't weld yourself to those mistakes. Don't let those mistakes become your writing identity, right? Allow yourself to grow, right? If you've said a couple of, maybe, you've made some stupid takes on Twitter, you've gotten ratioed several times or whatever, you don't need to let that now define you, that you become the stupid takes guy on social media. No, like, you made your mistakes, that's fine. Also allow yourself to grow, right? Because that's what I think I've done, and I'm still trying to do. Obviously, I am still a work in progress. There's nobody who is ever complete, right? Up until J.K. Rowling is not complete. Terry Pratchett is not complete. Nobody's complete. Everybody's a work in progress, but eventually, one day, hopefully, story will be told. So yeah, those are my few little tips on how to hopefully become a reasonably successful writer and journalist in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think at this point, I will finally mute myself because I'm starting to bore myself listening to my own voice. So that's to you, Taiwo.
Wow. That's actually 55 minutes and it's a lot. Yeah, thanks for the insights. I don't know where to start, honestly. Oh, but let me just chip in a question before we probably allow other questions. How do you find yourself in writing precisely? How did you manage to improve or work on your writing? Honestly, I don't know. Your work has been one of the best work that I read. Like just like, oh, where is this guy getting this word from? Where is this string of words coming from? What's the idea? What's the joke here? Like, how are you comfortable getting that very voluminous content? Like, how do you think I'm going to read it? I eventually get it finished, but then like how are you so sure that I'm going to get it finished? Like how do you find yourself in the writing space? How do you see yourself growing and till where you are now?
So I guess the single most important factor that explains why I'm able to use words the way I do is that I didn't have much of a childhood because my parents were extremely pushy parents. So literally all I did as a child was read. I mean, we had like TV and stuff, but like to give you an idea of how intense it was, we weren't that my I mean my family could easily afford like DSTV or whatever. We didn't have it until 2007 when I was already 17, when I was already leaving the house. All the while I was growing up, it was channels and NTA and GBN and whatnot. That's all. And even then, it was for a specific period of time within the day. Like you have like 2 or 3 hours of TV time that you're allowed in a day. And then obviously they were also Jehovah's Witnesses, so there was no you don't keep friends, you don't go visit friends, you don't visit your neighbors, nothing. So literally all there was to do was literally just sit down and read stuff. And in fairness to them, there was a sure fight of reading material, every kind of reading material you can imagine. Hitler's book, Mein Kampf. By the time I was 8 years old, I'd read it. Ask me how I'd read Hitler's book at 8 years of age. It was in the family library. Every kind of book you can imagine was there. So from the usual like children's fiction stuff like Mallory Towers, Famous Five, obviously all those kinds of like, books by Enid Blyton, Terry Pratchett, C.S. Lewis, the Dawn Treader, all those things they were there. I'd read all those things by the time I was 6 or 7. But beyond that, stuff like Time Magazine, Newsweek, Reader's Digest, The Economist, BBC Focus on Africa, back when it used to be a print magazine, every single edition, and this is not an exaggeration, every single edition from when I became aware of this, maybe this was 97 or 98, up until when I left home in 2008, every single edition of these magazines, Dad used to buy them. And that's in addition to all the daily newspapers. He used to buy the Vanguard, Punch, The Guardian, and at the time, Concord, back when it was still in print, every single day, including Sunday. And then they were all his university books. They're all my dad's university books. They're all in family library. My older siblings, all their secondary school and university books that they have stopped using were also in the family library as well. So one day, if I'm able to return to Nigeria, I'll take a picture of what the family library looks like. My family house. They're basically two really large rooms with shelves built into the wall and glass fronts, and it's just literally from ceiling to floor. Books, 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 magazines. Like that's all there was to do as a child. Read and create your own imaginary world, live in your own head, create your own friends. Like you literally have no choice than to become creative because what else are you going to do? There's no video games. We weren't allowed to have like PlayStations or anything. There was really nothing to do. We had a computer. We weren't allowed to have an internet connection until I was like 15 or so. So even the games I used to play on the computer, I had to hide. I'll uh, borrow games from my classmates in school on DVDs and stuff. Go home, play, hide and play in the dead of the night. And that's it. That's so there was really nothing else to do as a child but to read. So even though I absolutely hated it back then, what I would say is that the effect that it had was that whether I realized it or not, first of all, it was teaching me to become extremely conversant with language and how to use it. Because when you're constantly, the best way to write is obviously to read. The best way to learn how to write is to read other people's writing. So when you're constantly taking in a stream of other people's writing all over the world, first of all, you're not even measuring yourself against Nigerian standards. You're measuring yourself against global standards. So I think that was very important. And then secondly, the sheer variety of information that you are taking in, because it's fiction, it's non-fiction, it's history, it's current affairs, it's economics, it's science, it's everything. You're pouring it into one head. It's makes you, I don't want to use the term polymath because that sounds, it's a very, I think that's a term that is abused a lot. I wouldn't describe myself as a polymath, but it makes you knowledgeable about the world. And the more knowledgeable you are about the world, the more content you have to write about, basically. So I would attribute maybe 90% of the writing ability that I have to the fact that I wasn't allowed to do anything else as a child but read. That's literally all I was allowed to do.
Wow, that's awesome. And let me just chip this in. Do you think something that you replicate in your child? You would have one, or you already have one. There was one that you had one anyway. But is it something that you replicate in a child?
First of all, I don't have a child. I wish I did, but I don't. Secondly, I'm not. My child is definitely not going to have the kind of childhood that I had. Absolutely not. They're going to have a lot. Their childhood will be a lot more balanced. However, I also see the value in stuff like limiting their screen time and, or at least limiting their entertainment screen time, and making them understand the value of taking in information and reading just for the sake of itself. It's a very important thing. So I think I will definitely inculcate that into them as well. But no, I'm not going to police them like my parents policed me. I don't think that's a good idea either.
Wow, okay, that's great. There's a question from David on the how did you feel getting that first pay as a writer?
So that depends because when did I get my first pay as a writer? Like, as an independent writer, okay, that will probably be 2017. How did it feel? I felt as if, so I will actually tell you the story so you have an idea of how I felt. So this was shortly after my whole adventure driving Ubers, right? In fact, I think I was still driving Ubers. So, and I was looking for a way out of doing that because obviously, like, how the hell I have an undergraduate degree from the UK. Why am I in Lekki driving my car as an Uber? And at the time I was married as well. It was just like, what is going on with my life? Like, what is this nonsense? So I was looking for a way out, and I found a guy on Naira Land. Actually, my first ever writing client, I found him on Naira Land. Funny story. So I found a guy on Naira Land who was, I think he was doing like Fiverr or Upwork gigs. So what he would do was that he had an Upwork profile that apparently used to get a lot of these gigs, and then he would subcontract it to people that he found on Ireland. So I found back then I wasn't on Upwork, I wasn't on Fiverr at the time. So I found him and I sent in, like, he was looking for writers. So I think it was offering something like 3 naira per word, and the engagement was like 1,000 words or something. So it was going to be like 3,000 naira, which isn't much, but in my situation then, like 3,000 naira was like 2 trips. So it was like, okay, this is better than driving an Uber, definitely. So like if I can literally sit down somewhere with my laptop and something came out of my head and I can get paid for doing that, then Jesus Christ, like this is so, like, I will never ever ever have to go out at night because my Uber thing was always at night. I used to go out at 10 p.m., come back at 5 a.m. And I saw some really crazy shit at the times. I was really desperate to get out of it. So I sent in an can't even call it an application, but I did what he said in the thread, and he got back to me. He sent a little test. I aced it, and then he sent me some work to do. And he said, okay, that if I do this work successfully, that he'll pay me instantly. Because that's what I was concerned about. That are you a scammer? Are you actually going to pay? So I did the work, and he paid instantly. I cannot forget. So the previous night, it was very funny how it happened. So the previous night, I had gone out pretty much all night. I had done my Uber run, and then that morning, instead of coming back home to sleep as I used to do, I decided that I wanted to take my wife out, like, to work, so she wouldn't have to use public transport, right? So I dropped her off. She was working on Lagos Island. It was on Lewis Street, her office then. So I dropped her off at Lewis Street, and then that was when the email from the guy came in with the work that I was to do. And I literally sat down in the car. I didn't even wait till I got home. I sat down in the car because I had my phone with me. I had my tab. and I literally did it there. Like I did the assignment that he sent to me was like 1,000 words, and I did it right there in my car, and I sent it to him. And then I started driving home, and I remember I just crossed Third Mainland Bridge because I was living in Bariga at the time. I just crossed Third Mainland Bridge, right? I was just like turning off into Bariga, and then my phone beeped, and then I saw the credit alert for 3,000 naira, and it was like 3,000 naira is not a lot of money, but at that point in time, I just instantly knew that the world has changed for me, and like it's never going to be the same again because now I figured out that there is this is how I can go from basically from having this ability inside my head to actually monetizing it. This is how. Like I knew that it would get a lot bigger than that, but I'd never been able to figure out how. I tried to use Upwork and Fiverr them lot before, but it's very, very, very difficult to break into those places. Extremely difficult, especially if you don't have anything on your profile. Like it's pretty much sewn up already. You can't break in. So what he offered me was basically a chance to become a subcontractor, and then he was offering a really sort of steady pipeline of work. So from that very first payment, he was like, "Okay, I've seen the way now." And funny story, even though a few months later I went back to full time employment, I never stopped doing
Yeah.
those side gigs. I kept on doing all those side gigs. Eventually, those side gigs graduated into. I moved away from like Nigerian markets. I started doing work for the international market because some of those side gigs I was doing, I was starting to be able to put my name on them, and I was able to build up a following. And then from there, that's how it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then I started doing real money within like a year of that. So yeah, it was just 3,000 naira, but it might as well have been 3 million naira at that point in time because instantly I just had that light bulb moment that yes, I found it.
Okay, there's a question from Stoop Dude. Would you say you feel more fulfilled now that you're getting recognition as a journalist over when you get paid more as an agency owner?
Yes, because first of all, even though yes, the money was more as an agency owner, but the lifetime potential was less. So the thing is, what I've been able to do as a journalist, even let's talk just about money now, even in terms of money, what I've been able to accomplish as a journalist will eventually outstrip anything I would have been able to do as an agency owner. And what I mean by that is there are some things which you do them now, they don't pay out immediately, they have no material value to you now, but over the next 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 years, they start to vest and you start to see the impact of it. So, for example, in October 2020, I did a story about Marek Smyslowski. He's a Polish scammer who claimed to be one of the co founders of Jumia. And he has been going around the world selling a story about how a Nigerian investor tried to steal his company from him, and Interpol got involved, and blah 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 blah. So I did this very like this deep dive investigation into this guy, and I thoroughly exposed him as a scammer. And a movie production house actually picked it up, and I signed a production contract with them. So basically, like they're turning my story into a script, and instead of taking an upfront payment, what I negotiated with them was that I'll instead take a percentage of the revenue that the movie will make when it's produced, when it's released. So I made no money upfront. I mean, except you count the 20,000 naira that Newswire paid me to do the story. I didn't make any money from that story. But in terms of what it will do for me, even monetarily in future, it will be multiples of anything I could have done as an agency owner. So yes, apart from the feeling of fulfillment and the feeling that my work has more value now, it has a purpose now. There's also the long game that even financially in the long run, this will also be better for me. So it's about sort of taking that short term, the ability to sort of think long term. Like in the short term, you can definitely make more money as an agency owner. I know I could, even up till now, I could make more money if I sold myself. I could definitely make more money than I do now. But I always think in decades instead of in months and next year. So I'm thinking when I'm 40, when I'm 50, what legacy am I leaving behind for my kids? because that's how my dad taught me to think as well. Because he had a similar thing in his career. He was a civil servant, and when he retired, he was director of lands in Lagos State. So you understand how powerful that seat is. And yet, instead of using that seat to enrich himself, he always had that vision in his head that if he keeps his hands clean instead, and he's able to develop that reputation as this Oga who was sat on this very powerful seat and didn't ask anybody for anything and just got paid his salary and went home every day, that even after he leaves the service, he'll be able to use that bank of goodwill and continue building whatever career he's building outside of the civil service using that goodwill. And that's exactly what happened, because when he retired, he went into private real estate. He couldn't have been successful in his private practice if he wasn't able to coordinate very closely with the Ministry of Lands in Lagos State. And the only reason he was able to walk into that secretariat every day without getting booted out was because he was clean. Because they remembered him that this is that Oga that made this place enjoyable for everybody. This is that Oga that when you need your paper signed on his table, he's not going to ask you for 1 million naira to sign the paper. You need paper signed, he will sign it, he will give it back to you. He will not ask you for one kobo. So my dad always used to tell me that the lifestyle that you're enjoying, the schools that you're going to, this house you're living, everything you have, you are basically eating the fruits of my goodwill. And I saw it firsthand. He wasn't exaggerating, it is the fact. So that's how I've been trained to think that the legacy that you create for yourself, even financially, will be worth more to you in the long run than whatever millions you can make in the short term.
Well, that's awesome. Oh, you were once a copywriter, and I think once a copywriter should still be a copywriter. Which one do you find more challenging, creating a sales copy or writing a news piece?
Oof. Um, that's quite a difficult question, actually. In terms of the potential, like in terms of which one can ruin your life, definitely is the news one. Because if you make a mistake, you can destroy your entire career, right? But in terms of which one I personally find more difficult to put together, it's the sales copy. Because the thing with news is that it has a format which is fairly easy to recreate across several stories, especially if you're doing something like breaking news, which I was doing back then. Breaking news stories all have the same format. It's just if you studied mass comm in university, they call it the five W's and the H. So the
Yes.
who, the what, the where, the when, and the how. That's it. That's it, and that's your story. 250 or 300 words, you're done. Moving on to the next one. It's fairly routine. It's fairly straightforward. So it's not something that I find difficult to do. However, if you make any mistake within that, you can completely torpedo yourself, and people stop taking it seriously as a journalist. With sales copy, on the other hand, every single thing has to be bespoke. Every single thing has to be customized to the audience you are sending it to the market segment you are targeting, sometimes even to the specific customer you're targeting. It's a lot more challenging in my experience.
I agree with you. Your content are actually very conversational. I think Daniel feel like, what will you advise someone who desires to make his write-up more conversational?
Oof. I think the first thing you want to do is you want to read the work of people who whose work sounds the way you want yours to sound. I think that's the most important thing. You want to consume a lot of their work. As I said, the best way to learn how to write is to read. So, um, you Nigerian media content in general doesn't really fit those parameters. Nigerian media content is very, very formulaic. The way it was written in 1984 is the way it's still written today. It hasn't evolved, hasn't changed. It's very set in its ways. So I'm not saying you shouldn't read Nigerian media, but I'm saying you should try and reduce the amount of it you consume if you're trying to become a different kind of writer. So you want to read a lot of what's it called, the New Yorker magazine, Reader's Digest. A lot of these platforms are available to some extent freely online. So just consume so stuff like the Atlantic. Those so it's still serious content, but the style of writing is completely different. So for example, I'm sure you've been aware that part of the controversy that has surrounded my work for a long time has been that why does it sound the way it sounds? Like you are writing a story, you're telling a story like an important story, and it sounds like it feels like I'm reading a novel or something. Like this isn't how
Yeah,
to do
like in
journalism.
Hollywood scripts.
Yeah, exactly. Like this isn't how to do journalism, and that the people that say that thing say it's because, as I said, the Nigerian media space is very set in its ways, right? I have never measured myself against the Nigerian media space. I've always I read stuff in the New Yorker in the Atlantic. That is where you see these things and you pick them up and you get better at it. So my model has always been that um instead of learning like global best practices and then simply trying to play in the global space and run away from the Nigerian space, I'd rather learn that global best practice and then drag it into the Nigerian space and force the Nigerian space to start to come to, like up to speed with it. Right? I made that conscious decision in 2019 when I pivoted away from writing for them CCN whatever and writing for Nigerian platforms. I consciously made that decision that the voice I'm going to write in is the same voice I would write in if I was writing on the New Yorker magazine or in the Washington Post. It's the same voice I'll use here, even though the Nigerian audience doesn't understand it yet. I will use that voice and I will not apologize for it. And eventually the audience will catch up, which is exactly what has happened. A lot of the audience has started to catch up. So basically, just consume a lot of the content that you want your own content to sound like. And then when you put it out and don't explain, don't shalaye, right? Show, don't tell. And let your audience will either love it or they will trash it, and there'll be nothing in between. And that's fine.
Okay, to chip in something on what David already said, many of these platforms are paid. Actually, at a point, I feel like how many $2 and $10 am I going to pay you Forbes and then pay the economists and the like? Here's a secret tip: follow these people on LinkedIn. When they share the content on LinkedIn, you will bypass the paywall. I'm not the one sharing it, but then just an idea. So just follow the platform that you want to be read the content, New York and the likes. Subscribe, follow them on LinkedIn. Subscribe to their news channel later. When they share the content, when you click on it, you will bypass the paywall. You don't have to pay to get those content because it's more like you're
Even
using
if
reading LinkedIn.
even if you don't do that, there are several hacks for getting past paywalls. This is not something I'm supposed to say, but for the benefit of the Nigerian audience, literally, if you just Google how to get past a news paywall, there are several solutions for getting past every kind of paywall. As long as it's on the internet, it's available for free somewhere. So there's
Okay, so
always
that's the yeah, that's the tip. So uh, at the point you probably see some of your work that you've already written and you feel like there's some correction that should be made. How do you correct mistakes on news article? I mean, the ones that are already been published.
well, the most important thing is you shouldn't make a mistake in the first place. A major one. That's the most important thing. Because as a journalist, making a major mistake in a news article is surefire way to getting yourself cancelled, getting like losing your credibility. Credibility is the currency of journalism. Right? Evidence, credibility, proof. Without that, you have nothing. So you don't want to make the mistake in the first place. If you're making a mistake, let it be like some minor grammatical error or something. You don't want a major one. Now, if it's a major mistake, it happens from time to, it shouldn't happen often, but if it happens and you make a major mistake that needs to be corrected, what you would then do is that you put an editor's note. At least that's the accepted journalistic convention. You put an editor's note to amend the article, and you state that this article was amended at so and so date at so and so time and updated to reflect the fact that blah 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 blah. Blah. That's how. So I'll say so. In my case, the biggest mistake that I made, I think on West Africa Weekly was well, it wasn't a huge mistake, but it was a mistake nonetheless. When I did a story called "Conflicts for Jihad," the Boko Haram origin story, the first edition of the story, the first version of the story, it made a principal character in the story whose name was Yakubu Musa Hassan, or Yakubu Katsina. That was his. He's also known as Yakubu Katsina. I didn't realize that there were two people in northern Nigeria who are both Islamic clerics who both go by the name Yakubu Katsina. So I used the picture of the wrong Yakubu Katsina in the article, and this was pointed out. So later on, I then put an editor's note. I changed the pictures, the correct picture, and then I put an editor's note under it and said this article has been updated to with a new, and this there is this I forget the exact language I use, but basically this is an updated photo of Islamic cleric Yakubu Musa Katsina, blah 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 blah. This was why this edit was made and blah blah blah. So yeah, just put an editor's note. But yeah, hopefully you shouldn't be making those kinds of mistakes to begin with.
Okay, Divine, don't worry. I'll show you the mic now. Let me just get this question. As we all know that not just anyone can do journalism, what would you say informed decision to go these days, despite knowing the risk involved?
For me, it's a sense of purpose. Um, in 2013, when I came back to Nigeria from the UK, I genuinely came back to Nigeria with the idea that I would never have to leave Nigeria again. Nigeria was on an upward trajectory. There was this thing called Africa Rising. It was a thing back then, if you remember. It was a genuine thing that people would go to school abroad and come back to Nigeria because Africa was rising. Nigeria was the world's third fastest growing economy. There was a lot of upside. So when I came back to Nigeria in 2013, my passport even expired in 2015, and I did not renew it until 2018 because I didn't even care. Because I was like, this is home. Like, there's so much to do. And then people made the electoral choice that they made in 2015, and then they brought a certain person into power. And my entire life as I knew it just started to fall apart. All the plans I had stopped. So, for example, when I resigned from BHM to start up my first attempt at a content agency, and it failed. And why did it fail? It failed because we were in a recession. Why were we in a recession? We had no business being in a recession. Like, the global economy wasn't in recession. There was no reason for Nigeria to be in a recession. It was just the Nigerian government that did made some very strange decisions. So in 2018, 2019, when I was at that crossroads where I had to make that decision, that do I chase the money or do I chase the journalism? I felt as if, first of all, um, my Nigerian dream as I knew it has already been destroyed. It's not going to happen anymore. So that much was clear, that at some point I would have to leave the country. I didn't know when, but it was clear. All my friends were already leaving. Like, all my friends that I came back to Nigeria with, we all studied abroad together. Everybody was leaving. So I knew that at a point, me too, I would leave. I didn't know where to. Some were going to Australia, some were going to Canada, some were going to Germany, UK, Ireland. Everybody was just jackpine. So, like, I already knew that my time in Nigeria was coming to an end. My hope, my Africa Rising dream didn't come to pass. So I just felt like, okay, since this has already played out, and we're going to become kind of like our parents' generation, in that we're going to end up becoming a diaspora generation that'll be sending money home. Since that's the case, let me at least be able to tell my children that I did something, that I tried to be part of the solution, that I was part of the resistance. That I didn't just see the calamity happen and then just run away like everybody else did. I actually stayed to fight. I actually tried to do something. That was literally the thought process that I had when I made that conscious decision that I'm going to go after the stories that nobody else will touch. I'm going to touchlight them in a way nobody else has ever dared to touchlight stories in Nigeria. Even the language and the feel of the story is going to be very, very unapologetic in a way that Nigerians are not used to. I'm going to do that very deliberately so that it will be on record for the sake of posterity, for the sake of my children, for the sake of whoever will tell my story later one day, that I did something. That was literally my entire way of thinking back then. Obviously, since then, there are a few other things. that I've also, added to my decision. But back then, that was literally what led to that decision. That look, nobody else is going to do this, and look, this administration in particular has ruined my life pretty much. Like the life plan that I had, they've taken it away from me. It's not going to happen. So I might as well.
Okay.
As a writer, as a journalist, I don't know, but I think creating viral content is important if you want to really position yourself out there. Maybe not so viral, but maybe should viral. For a journalist, I think people who have created some kind of viral content have this kind of big name out there, and yeah, hopefully impactful too. And as writers, yeah, even getting on probably some big platform event, those kind of like try to create content that you can really point out to. Do you think there's a particular strategy to create content that can go viral? Maybe news content, maybe general articles, anything.
Um, so yes and no. Yes, in the sense that broadly speaking, things like writing on topical issues is more likely to get your stuff noticed. Topical issues are basically issues that are current, issues that are in the news that everybody's talking about at this point in time. So writing on topical issues is more likely to get your stuff noticed, especially if you're able to like if you know how to leverage social media properly, right? However, also know in the sense that the audience also knows when somebody is trying to sell to them, and the audience doesn't really like being sold to. So the audience, um, one thing I've seen some people do that doesn't really work, even established news organizations as well. I've seen them do it, and a lot of time it doesn't work. They try to force virality, like they've done something that they consider to be a big story, and then they'll come to Twitter and then they will just disturb you with it for the next 2 days. Like some of them will do a thread, this like, and every tweet in the thread has a link to the story, and they're using quotes from the story in everything in the tweets. Like sometimes it works, sometimes it falls flat on its face. Because one thing I've always said, and I'll continue to say, is that what will ultimately determine if a story gets the attention it deserves or not is how well it's told. It's how good the story is. It's not the amount of by force hype that you push behind it. Some people even go to the extent of using paid, ad services, like pay Twitter to promote stuff, pay Facebook, pay Google, do Google ads. You can't force virality. Social proof is a thing. So like in on West Africa Weekly, for example, it has never happened even once that I've had to force virality, like use money to force something to become viral. It hasn't happened. I've never needed to. Like, and it has also, by the way, it has also been the case that there have also been stories of West Africa Weekly that fell flat, that did not get much of a reaction. Because that's just it. Some stories are better than others. Some stories are more impactful than others. Some stories make um make more of what's it called? Make have more have more resonance with the audience than others. So you can't really force virality. And anybody who says that there's some kind of formula for making something viral, that person is a liar. It's not true. Nobody has any formula for making anything viral. If you like have 3 million followers on Twitter or wherever, there's a possibility that whatever you put out there will obviously get to a wide audience, but you still cannot guarantee what will and will not be viral. Nobody really knows. With your 3 million followers, you will tweet something and you will still get 60 likes and 30 retweets. It happens. You can't force it. Audience proof, like social proof, is a thing. So just focus on the quality of the content. If the content is good enough, it's the audience that will make it viral. It's not you. The audience, they they will do what's it called, word of mouth is what will do your work for you if it's good enough. That's what worked for me. It's word of mouth, really. If it's good enough, it will speak for itself. You don't need to, start using all those dark arts. And like I come from a marketing background, so I have a very clear understanding of what those dark arts are. I know how people use trending words, jump on trending topics, they will tweet about this thing and then include all the trending, all the entire Twitter trend board. They will go and tweet it under the tweet. All those tips and tricks, those things don't necessarily make any kind of difference.
All right. That's honest insight, and I really appreciate the answer. I did flash a
Let me just
questions.
and then let me also just point out that I don't have children. So the comment on screen I can see that says, "I hope you can reunite your children one day." When I said my children, I'm talking about children I will have someday. I currently don't have any children. I actually think we've exceeded our allotted
Yeah,
time.
and yeah, thank you very much for staying to this minute, and the audience, thank you for staying tuned still now. David, thanks for honoring this invitation and
Thank
the
you for
kind of
having me.
insight to share. It means a lot to us. Have a good night.
You too.
All right, all right. Good night, everybody. Wake up tomorrow.